Right, then we'll get going then for this evening. So, as mentioned earlier on, we are going to talk about yeast and what you can do with it, types of it, that sort of thing. We've previously had a couple of presentations on yeast fairly recently. If you go to look at our YouTube channel, that's youtube.com/@LondonAmateurBrewers. You'll find in November 2020, Phil Turner did a presentation on culturing up from a single cell from a bottle. And then in February 2021, Lee did a presentation on starters. And then we've had a couple more in 2021 from Andrew Patson from Lalmonds, talking about co-fermentation using 2 strains of yeast. And then also about the Philly Sour, which is the sort of sour producing yeast strain. So yeah, go and have a look at our YouTube channel for presentations and chats on those. So this evening I just took some notes from that we had on the Slack channel about things that people wanted to talk about. So I thought what we'd do first of all is there anything else that people want to discuss this evening that's not on this list? I'll add it onto there, and then we'll work our way through that, and and just sort of talk through it all really. So yeah, has anybody got anything they would like to add to this list that they want to discuss this evening?
I suppose one of them is obviously growing it up, but just ensuring that there are enough yeast for your particular brew. I think I've just done one from some bottled yeast, and I had no idea what it was, what it meant, and how many billions of cells it was. So sort of growing it, but also how do you know what it is? How much is there?
Okay. I think we'll cover that under yeast starters, sort of how long, how much, that sort of thing. But yeah, we can cover that in some detail. Anybody else want to add anything onto this list, or we'll just get into it?
Maybe temperature, like how you manage temperature fermentation or something.
Sure. Shall we
with the hot weather coming, or what you do for different strains?
We do have, there was Serge did a presentation on fermentation temperature control last year, I think it was. So that's also on the YouTube channel, but we'll talk about that. I don't think we'll necessarily talk about equipment, but yeah, talk about the temperatures and things like that.
Right, you talk about the temperature for fermenting a starter rather than the temperature for just a normal fermentation.
Okay, yeah.
I think that's...
Get into
I guess you can do room temperature, but then it's, if it is getting hot, would you need to start any temp control on a starter?
Okay.
Or if it's getting too cold as well, if you're trying to do it in the winter.
Okay.
Stressing yeast and purposefully stressing it. I don't know what that means. That's a thing.
All right. Okay. Well, I will take us through this list, and as we go through the evening. So yeah, let's first of all just quickly cover off types of yeast. I've not really prepared anything here, but it'd be good to just see, like, show of hands of. I'm assuming everyone here has used dry yeast before. Yeah. Okay. Has anyone here not used liquid yeast? No, everyone's used liquid yeast. All right then. Has anyone here used a yeast slant? Apart from me. Okay. So obviously dry yeast, very, very easy to use. I did use some at the weekend, in fact. Very easy to keep as well, because you can just sort of keep it in your fridge in a packet and then pull it out anytime within a couple of years or longer even, and use it when you need it. Whereas liquid yeast has such a much shorter lifespan. Although interestingly, looking at the latest packaging from White Labs, their sort of pure pitch next generation that comes in like this sort of toothpaste tube almost. You know, that originally it used to come in the little plastic vials, and then they switched to using this sort of plastic packet, and now they've got something that's kind of like a plastic packet with a nozzle at one end. And supposedly that stuff has near 100% viability for 6 months, because they've managed to keep so that apparently according to Chris White Labs, the key thing with yeast viability is keeping out carbon dioxide, and also I think oxygen as well. But basically they've improved their packaging to a level that stuff should last 6 months in packaging without any real fall off, as long as you keep it at fridge temperature. So yeah, it's interesting that sort of there's different things. You'll also see on the market as well, whereas most liquid yeast packets come with, used to come with sort of 100 billion cells supposedly, if you're using a calculator. There's also Imperial Yeast are doing sachets with 200 billion cells in there, and I certainly noticed that there's quite a lot more in those when they use them. The other newer thing that's on the market via Malt Miller, although I've been around for a few years, from Brew Labs, are yeast slants, which is where they've basically grown yeast on agar inside a little tube. So similar to the old tubes that you buy White Labs yeast in, there's basically an agar in there, and they managed to grow yeast on that. And you basically buy it like that, and you then have to grow it up to yourselves to sort of the full pitching volume. Now the thing about those is that although it takes a bit more effort to grow it up, the yeast stays very viable for a long time. You can potentially even just leave it at room temperature, although I'd probably best off to refrigerate it. But between that and the nutrients in the agar, it keeps the yeast very viable for a long time. And the way that you use it is basically you can either make a sort of 100 ml of dry malt extract wort, and then just put a little bit into the slant, give it a little shake up to take off some of the yeast cells, and then pour it into the rest of the wort. Leave that for a day or so, and then step it up to a litre from there. I think they give some slightly better instructions than mine, but that's the way I've done it in the past. But the other advantage of those slants is that you can actually partially use them. So if you have a sterile loop, so sort of normally just like a wire loop, you might have used one in sort of biology lab or something like that at school, or if you are a biologist or something like that these days. But yeah, you can get either a wire loop or disposable ones, which come ready sterile. You scrape that along a little bit of the slant to take off some of the yeast, stick that into your 100 ml of wort, give it a stir around, and then you've basically inoculated that starter. You can then recap that slant, put it back in the fridge, and save it for another day, and it will keep for quite a long time doing that. So that's another option, in that it'll keep for a long time. So Malt Miller are currently stocking them from Brew Labs. They are a lot cheaper, or they are cheaper than any liquid version of yeast. I think they're about £8 for a slant. So and now I think it's sort of starting for £10 upwards for a liquid yeast. Certainly the ones I had from White Labs the other day, that their new packaging I think was £13. So yeah, it's I think this is a good subject to discuss today, as sort of how to keep yeast, how to reuse it, how to get the most out of it.
How many batches do you reckon you get out of a slope? They're £6.99 at the minute. Which
Okay,
seems
yeah,
pretty reasonable.
£6.99.
Yeah.
Probably I would have thought you could probably do 3. I mean, I've only ever done it personally. I've done 2 off of a slope before. But it's one of those things, each time you open up the tube, you're risking getting something in there. So you have to sort of, ideally sort of keep the thing slightly, it doesn't fall out or anything, so you can actually keep it slightly upside down so you don't end up with bits of dust or anything floating into it. Run the loop over it, quickly inoculate it, and then cap it up again. So yeah, you could use it multiple times, or you can use it multiple times.
Sorry.
No, go on, Steve.
Step it up like several
Yes.
times to get
Yeah,
to a
you're-
viable liter or so.
Yeah. Well, you can go you go up 10 times in each step. So when I've done it before, I put it into 100 ml of wort, and then from there I went up to a liter. So like after ran that starter for, I think, just a couple of days, just left it on the side of in the kitchen, gave it a little shake every time I walked past, and then after a couple of days, put that into a liter, and that went off absolutely fine.
And you could overbuild the starter. You can probably talk about that in a bit, but you can overbuild that starter each time from a slope.
Yeah.
Anyway, and save a bunch of that. Sounds like a better way to do it. Yeah.
The malt mill are even selling blank slants as well, so you can not inoculate your own if you want to, if your technique is good enough for that sort of thing. But yeah, you can potentially buy those slants that are empty and put your own yeast onto them. So it's another thing you can do.
I think you're going to talk about that later or now, because that sounds very interesting. How one does.
I've got no idea about doing that. Has anybody else done it?
I watched the video.
That's
Basically the opposite. You get your little sterile loop, dip it in the yeast you want to store, and just wipe it over the top.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether you could actually put the yeast that you've just built, you could put some of it back on the slope that you got it from originally, maybe as well.
I've not done it with brewing yeast, but I've done it with like other things. Like, yeah, it's quite good in a way as well, because you can tell how, if you get the streaking right on it, you can actually tell if the culture you've got is contaminated as well by like the morphology of the little colonies that grow. If they look a bit different, you haven't got only one kind of yeast. So,
I mean, you can buy the little vials on eBay or whatever, the sterile vials, and get the agar yourself, I think, and then you can do interesting things like change the nutrient slightly and so on, if you're into experimenting.
I mean, it's one of those things where I looked into doing it, and I even bought some of the stuff, but it's quite a bit of, I decided it was quite a lot of work, and seen some other people do it where it's very difficult to get it sort of contamination free. I mean, once you made the slant and cool it and then leave them in the cupboard for a couple of weeks, you'll see if you've contaminated it, because there's anything growing on it, and then you can take it out and put your yeast onto it from there. So yeah, there's I guess it depends on, yes, how contaminant free you can keep things. Generally, as brewers, we kind of it sort of carpet bomb the work with yeast. You're not just putting one cell in there and letting it grow up. You're putting in vastly an enormous amount of yeast, basically, and sort of so it tends to outcompete anything else that might get into your wort. But when you're working on a much smaller scale with a very small amount of wort, it's getting tricky, and particularly when you're trying to go the other way as well and extract a small amount of yeast, reduce it down to a few cells or a few colonies, and then grow it back up again.
I think it's all down to sterile technique, and I think that can be incredibly complicated. Warm air rising away from you, all of that sort of thing. Now, when I've seen people doing it properly, it's spraying everything down, it's gloves, it's doing it in a room without air flowing through it, and I think for a lot of people it's too much.
But Phil's presentation on YouTube does go over all of that. So yeah, go and have a look at that.
They were doing it at Brew, I think at the very first BrewCon, actually. Brew Labs were there, and they were inoculating stuff as the day went by, and they basically prick out a whole bunch of tubes for you, and I took away a couple. But the one I did was rancid. It was like someone had just burned a mountain of Band-Aids. It was just horrid. Probably the worst infected beer I've ever had, I think. But yeah, I think like you say, because you're dealing with such a small number of cells, your sanitary procedures just become, more than paramount, don't they? Because everything is amplified as you grow stuff up again.
Yeah, the other thing I put on the list to sort of briefly talk about, I don't know how much people know about it, is that more recently the yeast companies have started to mark their yeasts, particularly White Labs and Y Yeast, as with certain genetic markers. So the two you'll mainly see are STA1 and POF positive. STA1 is the gene for whether the yeast is diastatic or not. So what that means is your normal, most of the yeast we will tend to use, ale yeast and lager yeast, in fact, we expect them to attenuate to a certain level, like sort of 1010 or whatever for your sort of standard US05. But when we talk about Belgian yeasts or Saison yeast or things like that, they attenuate more. And what's happening there is quite often the yeast is producing a diastatic enzyme that helps it basically attenuate further. It breaks down some of the longer chain sugars, so it can metabolize those, dry the beer out further. That's the STA1 gene. So if you go and have a look on the White Labs site when you're looking at the yeast on there, say whether it's STA1 positive. The other one is POF positive, which is phenolic off flavor. Now they call it an off flavor, but in some cases phenolic flavors are desirable, again in some of the sort of Belgian yeast and that sort of thing. So you might see that. I think even some of the British yeasts contain it as well, albeit it might be at a lower level. But it's worth keeping in mind of anything you're worried about contaminating your brewery with. If you're worrying about Brett and things like that, you should also consider about these yeasts that are STA1 positive, particularly because if your sanitation and cleaning isn't good, you'll find all of your beers start to over attenuate a bit. So the next thing on here was to talk about yeast starters. So at this point, I was sort of just going to go around the room kind of thing and find out what people like to do with their yeast starters. Personally, for virtually any liquid yeast I have, I will do a starter. I tend to do it on my stir plate, and it will tend to be a litre unless it's a lager, in which case I'll go 2 or even 3 litres. And I'll usually let that go for a day before sticking it in the fridge to crash all the yeast out. And then on brew day, I decant off the liquid on top and then stick the actual yeast solids into the brew itself. So that's how I tend to do it. But yeah, I'm interested in what other people do. Does everyone use stir plates and do you decant the whole thing, or what do you do? So yeah, who wants to start on that?
I have got a stir plate thing, and the first few times I did it, I did decant everything off and swirl up the yeast a bit, but then I thought it's kind of like a litre of, it's not beer, it's kind of fermented out by then. But recently, and especially on the weekend, I did one up to a litre and split it between 2 beers, and it just made it easier to do, easier to gauge half and half from a litre into a porter and a bitter. But I mean, for a liquid, I'll always, I think, do a starter. I used to not, and then I used to get a lot of under attenuation and off flavors, but it makes a big difference.
I thought you were going to say there for a minute that you're sad about wasting the beer that you made in the starter, so you just chugged that and then on the brew day.
That's what I
It's delicious.
Yeah, starter
really-
wort is delicious.
It's really stale or something. There's something weird about it.
That's my issue with it generally, is that if you've left it any longer than sort of 12 to 16 hours, it starts getting oxidized, and then it's just not nice to tip that into your beer. But, or at least I didn't think it was, but I've been doing it my way for so long now, I probably wouldn't know either way. And especially when you're doing like 2 liters into 20 liters of beer, I always assumed it would cause some issues, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So if you want to step that up, James, would you just again carry on just leaving it for the 24 hours and then decant off the first bit and then put some fresh wort in it and keep growing up like that? And
Well,
just
personally,
every 24 hours.
I wouldn't step it up beyond the 2 liters, because I don't have a vessel big enough for it.
Yeah.
And as I said, that's why I generally go. Personally, I go up like 10 to 20 times the size of wort. I think 10 times is the sort of rule of thumb. So if you do that, you can basically do it like 12 to 24 hours later, because the yeast should be done growing in that length of time. So yeah, then you just chuck the whole lot in. You don't need to worry about crashing it out, things like that. But that's my thinking anyway. What does everyone else do? Mick, what do you do?
Well, I mean, generally I use dried. I mean, odd occasions where I have used the liquid yeast. Again, I've got a stir plate, homemade stir plate that seems to work fine. And it normally kicks off and you get a nice krausen on there. But I think maybe that's where I've been going wrong, is because I'm leaving it too long in there. Sometimes maybe 3 days, and maybe that's where it's just going a bit stale. I mean, if we've still got activity in the flask on the stir plate, do you leave it, or is it a case of once it's got to krausen, even though there might be a few bubbles still rising, is it still a case of okay, it's done?
What do we think?
Open questions.
If it's still going, I've usually just pitched it, the whole thing straight in, because it smells fine at that point. I was just going to say, the one I did on the weekend, a very quick backstory, was a mix of Yorkshire and London Ale 3, I think. It was one I made, and this is leading to something. It was one I made from 2 fresh yeast packs that were like 2 years old anyway. So I did a starter for them, and it worked fine. Normal, took a couple of days. And then the slurry I kept, but the big fridge where I keep everything froze down to -9 one day. So this was just an update on that. So I got the slurry out and wanted to grow some of that up for these 2 beers on the weekend, and it took 4 days for it to it took 3 days to show any activity, and I was about to give up. And then it started going that kind of nice light brown milky color on the 4th day. And you say, Mick, a little bit of activity in the whirlpool bit in the middle. I was like, oh God, yes, it's alive, it's alive. And then within a day, it seemed like it had kicked right up. So half went in the porter, which was going crazy in 12 hours, and half went in the bitter on Sunday, which was going crazy in 12 hours. And that led me to the top cropping, because I want to, if I manage to get it to survive being 2 years old in the first place, then being frozen, and then being and then kicking off really well, I want to be able to save some of it just in case it's some kind of super yeast.
Oh, I guess the question is what's the goal of a starter? Because yeast goes through 4 sort of distinct phases in fermentation, where it's first of all the lag period, or the adaptation period, where it's getting used to the wort and stuff like that, taking up nutrients that are there, like oxygen. The second is the growth phase, where it's budding and essentially multiplying. Then it goes into fermentation, when it reaches sort of maximum level or has used up all of the available nutrients. And then when it's run out of sugars it can metabolize, it goes dormant. And I think at that point it also sort of picks up some nutrients, things like that, before going dormant. But it's just what is the point? And this is an open question because I don't know. Is the point to simply grow enough yeast? Is there a difference for it being healthy, so not exposed to too much alcohol? I don't know.
Well, all I know is that it's the number of cells is crucial, isn't it, to the strength and the volume of wort. So there's direct correlation to the number of healthy cells that you introduce to this food source. So I'm assuming that too many and you're going to cause one thing to happen, too few and like you'll probably cause a stressing situation. So I assume that it's something down to the biology of the yeast having that available food source in those conditions. So I mean, people go on about cell count a lot, don't they? I mean, that seems to be a common thing when people are pitching, is you're trying to get enough cells in there for the wort.
Well, this is one of the things I've looked at more recently, is the call about the vitality of the yeast. So essentially, how ready is it to reproduce or multiply? And because, for example, the more recently we're being told not to, or basically there's no point in aerating or oxygenating if you're using dry yeast, because it's packaged with all of the nutrients it needs. And essentially it should be able to, it's packaged with everything, so it should be very, very vital the moment it's rehydrated and be able to multiply massively. Whereas you could have a pint of clapped out yeast that has just finished fermenting an imperial stout, and that's questionably healthy, or the health around it and its ability to do that is questionable. So I don't know. Again, I don't know what the answer is, but I guess you want to sort of be reaching with enough yeast that is also healthy.
Yeah, so with enough oxygen to build the lipid membranes or whatever it does initially, so that because I gather a lag phase is essential. I've often been impressed with some yeast by the fact, oh, this is shot off like anything, to now realize that actually a lag phase isn't a bad thing. It's a natural part of the, like you were saying about the cycle. The lag phase it's not, oh, how quickly does my thing start, but actually does it have a lag phase and then have a healthy development, a growth stage?
Yes, and a lot of the flavors that you get are from the lag and the growth phases. So particularly and those phenolic flavors and things like that can all be produced during that phase. Equally, if you underpitch yeast, you can end up with things like diacetyl, which are produced early on in the I think produced during the growth phase, and you can end up with the yeast having to multiply too much, producing too much diacetyl or acetaldehyde that it then can't reabsorb at the end. So it's another issue.
My just going back to your original question, James, of do you let it finish out or not? My issue there has always been I guess sort of a practical one. But you know, when it's hitting Krausen, even though it's probably at its most vital, at that point, if you're going to pitch it, you can't really chill it at that point. You're in for pitching the whole starter. So whereas if you let it, or you let it run completely and then drop it out, and then you can get rid of it, nascent fluid on top or whatever you call it. So I've only ever done a Krausen pitch where I've had a smaller starter, because like you, I just worry about adding 2 liters of starter wort to a beer. So I think I've always done the dropout thing, let it go on the whole course, maximum number of cells, I guess, and then dropped it out. And
do you find it's not crashing out if you try and do that, or is there another worry as to why not refrigerate it at high Krausen?
I think I've tried a few times, mainly when I messed up my timing and the brew day was on top of me, and I was finding that I was getting up in the morning, and despite maybe a day's crashing, it was still very milky. Like it wouldn't drop properly. And then I started probably a little bit unnecessary. I started worrying about that thing about if you're not careful and you don't crush it out enough, you end up with all the early settling yeast going into the beer, and not the ones that are the more vital ones that will actually finish it off, that take longer to drop. Yeah.
Would it make a difference if your yeast was something that dropped out particularly differently, say, than another yeast? So if you're using that process, perhaps some yeast that flocculate particularly better, would they be easier to deal with in that respect? Or
I mean, I suppose there are some yeast like it was 002 or the some of them just, you could barely rouse them off the, you got the stir plate running at max and the bloody stuff won't barely come off the bottom, will it? So it's like stirring up curdled milk. So I suppose they're easier, but yeah, I would, I've always just let it run completely. I think I've only pitched it at Krausen a couple of times when, like I say, when I was running very small starters.
Yeah, the WLP002, the sort of London strain, and the imperial version of it, AO9 pub, it's like you put the thing in and it's like sort of these big blobs just floating around in it, and it's so flocculent, like even once it's dissolved, I think when I did a starter with it, a few hours later I came down and it had like gone back into chunks again, so it literally grown in blobs in the stir plate. It was unbelievable. But it ferments like a rocket and then just drops and turns into concrete on the bottom of your fermenter, so you get a bright beer very, very quickly. Whereas I guess that's a good point to actually mention. Obviously, different yeasts do different things. So that's a very flocculent yeast, and then at the other end you've got things like US-05, which is quite dusty, and you sort of you walk past it and it sort of stirs up the yeast quite often until it's sort of had some time sitting at the bottom. So it can be difficult to crash that sort of yeast out, really. I guess it's the question of more often, I think, with yeast, it's kind of you're pitching so much that close enough is good enough. Who else does starters? Does anybody not use a stir plate? Rob?
Yeah, I did, and then mine broke, and I thought, oh, I was trying to put it on and it wasn't working, and I thought, well, hang on, can I just blast it with oxygen instead? And that worked really nicely, so I've just done that since. So I've got like a conical flask and like the oxygen bottle with like a little tube and one of the stones, and I leave it in there and just once a day give it a quick squirt of oxygen. That seems to work quite nicely. And the supernatant that you cut, it's not quite as nasty as before. I don't know if that's relevant, but it doesn't actually smell as bad as it did before.
Well, I've seen some people who go for the shaken method. Is that not?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking about. Yeah, I think you get just give it a massive shake and it seems to work as well. I've got no way to count like cell counts or anything, but
I've done it as well. I literally taken like a sort of 5 litre water bottle and just shaking the some wort until it's basically foam, and then chuck in the yeast, and it worked fine. So
because I think that the idea of a stir plate is people say to oxygenate it, but the increase in surface area for oxygen to transfer into the wort is actually quite small. Like it works to keep the yeast agitated and moving
nearer
Through the
the
available nutrients.
yeah, nutrients, and I think also to drive off carbon dioxide as well.
Yeah.
I think that does make a difference.
But for getting oxygen in, I don't think it has a huge effect.
I've done the shaken starter as well during a brew day. So literally first wort came off, gave it a very quick boil, and well, like, yeah, first litre of wort, something like that, I think it was, and gave it a sort of couple of minutes boil. Then did the cooled it down, shook it, put the yeast in, and this was using a Weissbier yeast. And yeah, before I got my main wort cooled, I already had Krausen.
Yeah. I like the idea of pitching active yeast. I don't know if that's better or not, but it feels better to me.
Well, I think that gives you that's like the sort of whole double oxygenation or double aeration of your wort, because essentially you're doing it, letting it absorb and grow up, and then you're doing it again into your main wort. So
yeah,
and I've done that when it's like sudden brew day, even leaving the main bulk of the wort in the fridge overnight, whilst getting a starter going with the first runnings of the wort for sort of 12 hours or so.
Yeah, but when
I was going to mention that
normally it's ready by the time you're ready to pitch. The starter's going. Right.
Go on, Joel.
I was going to mention that's basically all I ever do. I was very impressed that you guys managed to do starters 2-3 days in advance, but I basically only ever just do the kind of first running there, pitch the yeast, basically just to make sure that it's actually active. And to get a little bit of a head start on it, and then by the time my wort is cooled, then I'm ready to pitch it. That's I consider myself a bit of a lazy brewer, so I don't want to bring up my lazy tactics, but that's all I ever do. But then again, I rarely use liquid yeast, just because it's more expensive, to be honest. But I do repitch yeast from previous batches, so I guess that's liquid yeast as well.
Well, we'll come on to repitching in a bit. Yeah, has anybody else got any other views on this, that contrary to what we've said already about sort of decanting or using the entire pitch or stir plates, and going to talk about overbuilding as well?
I was wondering, when do you stop stirring? So the one I just did, I left it for a couple of days, and I was thinking, well, should I carry on stirring it? So I was going to leave it. I wanted to do it for 3 days, then crash it before decanting some out to save, so that I'd overbuilt. But I was just wondering whether, kind of when it's finished doing its stuff, should I stop stirring it so it can start dropping out, or would I wait until I'm purposefully kind of cooling it? If there's like a good time to start, I guess, because the one thing I did find is overnight the little stir bar had stopped. So then when I went to restart it in the morning, it fizzed everywhere because there's loads of CO2 dissolved in it. Plus I was trying to get 3 litres of starter in a 3 litre flask, which does not go. Yeah, I just wonder if anybody's got any views on that, on whether you just leave it stirring until the end, or whether you just do it for the beginning.
I think once the Krausen dies down, it's almost like a mini fermentation. Once the Krausen dies down, then I turn off the bar and I chill it down, and then on brew day pour off the top like James does, and then sometimes I'll add a bit of starter water, not starter water, but a bit of the first runnings to it to get it going. But usually, then what I find is it goes berserk in and I end up with more mess to clear up. So sometimes I don't do that as well.
Does anyone harvest yeast from the starter to save for the next batch rather than saving the yeast cake?
That's what I just did with this one. It calculated 2 litre starter just for the normal pitch, and then I overbuilt by 100 billion cells. So I was thinking that's how big the packet is. So that should be enough to do another starter next time. And that gave me sort of a 3 litre starter. So then before I crashed it, I gave it a good stir, and I kind of poured out a litre into a sterilised litre mason jar, and then crashed it to sort of decant and pitch. But now I'm waiting for the next question of how long can you leave that in a fridge?
Joel said in the chat, did you already discuss hopping a starter? So does anybody put hops in their starter? No, I mean, I can somewhat understand maybe the antimicrobial properties of it, but
yeah, that was why somebody recommended it to me, but I just couldn't see it. Like, it just seemed a little bit over the top, and also it seemed like unless you're wanting to save it for a week or something, I just didn't see why you would need to do that. But even then,
I might be more keen to pour it in if that remnants actually had a decent taste to it. I think.
Oh, back to Steve chugging his starter.
Yeah, I tried some of the when I was decanting it. I poured some into a cup just to make sure it didn't taste completely foul, and it just tasted like non-hopped malt liquor, basically. And it's a bit sweet, alcoholic, but with no bitterness to counteract it.
Yeah, I've not known anyone that adds hops to it. I guess unless you're culturing up from a bottle or something like that, maybe, where you're worried about bacterial infection, but yeah. So yeah, we're also talking about overbuilding starters. Do people do that very often? I guess then the next question we'll get onto is potentially storing yeast.
I've done it quite a bit, I think. Lee did a really good presentation, which included about overbuilding as being a better, like, purer way, maybe get purer yeast than scraping the slurry off the bottom of the bucket kind of thing. And I started doing it after that. And I don't know if I could tell the difference as such, but commonsensically, maybe it feels like it's better and probably more viable, healthier maybe. And I kind of keep it in lots of little tiny kilner jars, and kind of keep them in the fridge and label them up because you always forget. I was going to ask whether anybody thought that how many times you can overbuild. Does the character change if you kind of have overbuilt your first one, save a bit, and then bring that out and overbuild that one, split it into 3 kind of thing? Wonder how many times that's doable.
I think you can get away with it many times. It just depends upon your quality of sanitation.
Yeah, exactly.
Of everything.
Sure. Yeah.
The starter sort of jar and the lip of that, and then your jar that you're keeping the yeast in, and
trying not to breathe.
Yeah, literally any time you're pouring it and it's touching something, you need probably better than Star San to sterilize the stuff, really. I mean, I've gone growing up yeast from bottles of beer, and despite sort of using a sort of kitchen blowtorch on the lips of everything and boiling the wort and everything else, I've still had infections. It's one of the good reasons to do starters, because you can quite often pick up infections because it will smell quite medicinal.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. Yeah.
If you're not sure about it, if it's not pure where it's come from, then potentially do it. Maybe let it ferment out, and then you'll know if it's really horrid. I think the wild yeast infections that I've had with that in the past have been pretty obvious.
It's a good tip.
Okay.
Does it sometimes depend on the strain of yeast on how many times you can regenerate as well? I mean, if you look at some of the details on the White Labs site, because that's the only liquids I've ever used as the White Labs. I've not touched any of the others. So I know from reading the details, it just says on some of those you can get away with 2, sometimes 3, or sometimes 4 repitches or regenerations of it. So I just wonder, has anyone sort of gone for broke and gone for 6, 7, 8?
No, I think we've done 3 generations. That's with reusing dried yeast. But I've read somewhere that people are claiming that, because I've been using the verdant yeast recently, that's best at a 3rd generation. And I think that was from them, from Lallemand or whatever themselves, were saying it's actually a good yeast to reuse. It seems to come into its own on 3rd pitch or something. 3rd reuse, rather.
I think I've gone up to about 5, but mainly I wouldn't go. I've, in the past, not gone more than 3, and that's mainly because I'd start with like a light beer, and then have a regular beer, and then do like something triple IPA or something like that, and use it to build the yeast along the way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have managed to save yeast and then reuse it serially. That was actually when I got the Fuller's yeast out of bottles of 1845, and I kept it going for a while, and then it eventually picked up an infection.
Well, Harvey's notoriously repitch their yeast all the time. It's one of their selling points, isn't it? That they take the big white 20-litre buckets and pretty well pour the stuff into a tank next to the fermenters, and then pour it out of that back into the fermenters when they've got an next brew.
Yeah, I think
that's how all big commercial guys did it, or medium-sized commercial guys.
Well, I get the impression that even the commercial brewers, I think they go for 6 or 7 uses of their yeast if they're brinking it.
I've
Because
heard
otherwise it wouldn't be worth having a yeast brink and all of that setup if you're only going to use it a couple of times.
Yeah.
And I think
I've been to there's a brewery over in Essex called Wibblers. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of it or had any of their beers. I think he's got about a 10-barrel plant over there. He's been running for quite a long time. And when we've been there for a brew day, we've had sort of home brewing groups there. And basically, one of the guys is at the top of the ladder, and he's got this wire mesh thing on a handle, like you get your chips out the fryer with, and that's what they're using to skim off the top of the fermenter into a sort of 5-litre plastic bucket, and when the bucket's sort of nearly full, they take it off, and that's going into the next brew, and that's just it. Well, you're top cropping. So, and
when we get to it, that's the same as Krausening for like German beer, is that right? Top cropping and then slinging it in the next one.
Yeah.
It's just when you got an ale. I mean, obviously
yes,
because that's when you top fermentation. I mean, I don't know if it would still work for a lager.
Krausening is
in the Krausening on the lager.
Krausening is I think Jerome is going to cut in and say this, but it's slightly different because Krausening is using it to essentially it's using it to carbonate your beer by taking like a wort that's just hit high Krausen and putting it in with your fermented beer to carbonate it. But yeah, top cropping. Is that you were going to say, Jerome?
Yes, yeah, that's top cropping. I mean, that's more like your Burton process, isn't it? Where you've got the barrels with the yeast pouring out into the troughs, and then you're basically taking that.
The Burton Union.
I've been doing a similar thing myself because I got a bit mean on volumes in one of my fermenters is a Blickman, and it's got a flat top conical thing. And I was overfilling it. When I started using the verdant yeast, it's very, it goes mad, and it produces a lot big krausen. And so it was ended up blowing off into my blow off jug. So I ended up on one occasion recently actually just taking that blow off in a sanitized way and then dumping it straight into a beer. So I was using basically top cropping it, and that was a really, really nice brew. The yeast was in perfect condition, and putting it straight into a brew. I mean, you know, within hours of taking it, I was just pouring it straight in.
Yeah, I mean, the coming back to the subject a little while ago, in terms of repitching, obviously there's British breweries that have been repitching their yeast for decades.
Yeah, saying
but also some of them have some interesting behaviors, and that you'll see. I think it's Sam Smith or someone that has like these fish tails that essentially take the yeast from the bottom of the fermenter and then spray it back over the top of the beer, because their yeast has become so flocculent, and also to help keep it sort of aerated as well. So yeah, they've got weird stuff like that happening. I've also, I mean, generally I've heard of breweries going 10 times with their yeast, and that's with conical fermenters, where obviously each time they're taking the yeast off the bottom of a conical, so they're taking more flocculent yeast, and you find sort of by, I think it was sort of 8, 9, 10 times of repitching, it would get a bit too flocculent, at which point they would have to go back to a fresh pitch of yeast. But yeah.
I think the other problem with the conicals as well is that the yeast does suffer from huge amounts of hydrostatic pressure. And I think if you're trying to, ideally a top cropping yeast, you would top crop it, because that's what the ideal way of taking another generation from it. I think by allowing it to drop through a conical fermenter, which could be sort of meters deep, I think you do get a different yeast out of the bottom of that, or at least you're more likely to get probably more dead cells. So
yeah, I think that's obviously much more on a large commercial scale than a homebrew conical.
Yeah, I don't think I'm not going to go for a flat fermenter myself.
when you got like a 10 barrel fermenter or something like that, 1,500 liters, and with the fermenter that's going sort of 20 meters into the air, and there's a lot of hydrostatic pressure on that yeast at the bottom. Right, what are we talking about? So yeah, going into sort of bottom and top cropping of yeast. So has anybody done top cropping? Because this is something I know nothing about, but yeah, has anyone done top cropping of yeast?
Well, that was essentially what I was saying.
Right.
I've got 300 milliliters of really nice yeast, which was just blown off through the port into a sanitized vessel. I'm probably going to get one of those Firmzilla containers to use as a yeast brink. But basically, by blowing that off and then into another container that actually had Starsan in it, so the yeast ended up piling up in with wort on the top, and so that is, as far as I can work out, top cropped, and that does work well. I mean, I think the other thing is that if you leave it, then you've got a time break. If you're after you reusing yeast and you're not brewing very quickly, then actually taking it off the bottom, that's a few days after high krausen, so it gives you a little bit more of a window if you're pouring it off the bottom, say if you've got a conical.
Do you do that with specific yeast?
No, it's actually, well, it's because of this verdant yeast, which is particularly good for, I think, you know, having looked at the krausen afterwards, the krausen line and so on, but it doesn't drop out that well either initially. I found with this yeast, with verdant, it's actually, I have to soft crash it before I can actually get a pour out of it. Whereas some things like the, say, 04 or something, it tends to drop out a lot sooner, and I don't have to pour it out before soft crashing.
Even soft crashing with that though, you have to get it down to about 12 before it's even worth trying to really get anything from it, because
Yeah,
it
but
just
that's
doesn't
that
work very
yeast.
well.
Yeah.
Does anyone have a conical that they can bottom crop yeast off of? Mick, can you tell us about it? It's something I'm interested in because I've cropped yeast at the end of fermentation. I'll talk about that in a second, but I do have a conical I need to put into use, so I'm wondering about.
No, I've never done it. I just
Well, I did.
I do open the valve and down the drain.
Really?
What a waste.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Generally because I'm not going to be brewing again for maybe a few months.
Raf's taking some out of the bottom port at the moment, aren't you, Raf?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
For the next, ready for the next brew. Just
Yeah,
bought. We've just
how long can we keep that in the fridge for? A couple of months?
No, no more than 2 weeks.
Yeah, see, I wouldn't be brewing again within 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think you can keep it for a lot longer. I mean, all it comes down to a case then is the viability. I mean, I don't think anyone here bothers to. Has anyone here counted cells? No. I mean,
we've got the microscope waiting, but we've just not used it yet.
I've got the microscope and the hemocytometer, and one of these days, when I actually sort of get into that aspect of brewing, of actually keeping yeast properly, I'll do a count of cells, because from what I gather, that is the only way of knowing how many your viability. You can use these calculators, but like any calculator, like a water calculator or whatever, they're based on something that's based on something to get you somewhere else. And I think the yeast calculators, from what I gather, different software will give you wildly different numbers. And I think, from what I gather, the only way of doing it properly is to count the bloody things. You know, is to literally get some yeast, some of your yeast out, put it under a microscope, stain it, put it under a microscope, and sit there with a clicker. In fact, I think you can get software that'll do it for you these days that count healthy cells, but that is the only way of actually getting a true value of what you. So I think when people talk about pitch rates, I think you just make sure you throw enough at it and a bit more. Err on the side of overdoing it than underdoing it.
Yeah, it's really hard to overdo it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's literally use
The other
10
thing with
times
mine is,
more
I
than you
mean,
need, but
I will very rarely brew the same beer again, so I'll change styles quite often. So if I'm going to do a Belgian double, then I'm going to go back into, I don't know, a Westie, or then I might be going into a Saison or something. So I mean, the fact that I need different yeast for each brew anyway. So yeah, that's generally why I don't harvest any.
Going back to the thing we talked about at the beginning with slopes, you can freeze slopes, I think, can't you, within the agar, I believe. I think
Well, you can, Steve.
Well, no, the other thing I was going to say, is freeze that slurry, works fine.
Yeah, I mean,
I believe you can freeze the agar stuff.
Well, I have had yeast frozen, but in glycol.
Sorry.
Which stops but this wasn't done by me. This was done by somebody that was a microbiologist at Imperial College, and they basically took a yeast and isolated it, and then gave me some very, very little capsules with glycol and yeast in them, and you can freeze them. And because glycol won't freeze at least at domestic freezer temperatures, I don't know if it goes down below that, you don't get the ice crystals forming, which normally destroys yeast cells.
I've got a litre of glycol because I was going to mess around with doing exactly that just to see whether it worked. Having frozen some yeast myself once by accident, and it did work. But I think freezing, this was dried yeast I'd frozen. It did actually work, but not brilliantly. But no, I've heard about using glycol because basically you don't want the cells to burst. Yeah.
Well, I can imagine if you freeze dried yeast, there's no water there, so it should be kind of okay, but kind of unnecessary to freeze it.
Yeah.
Joel's got his hand up. Go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, I actually did it. The instructions I saw were to put glycerin in it, which is a much more kind of readily available
Sorry,
food product.
glycerin, not glycol.
Yeah, okay. I didn't know if you misspoke or if it was another technique or whatever. But
no, it
yeah,
is.
I did that with some glycerin, which you can get as a sort of food product.
Is it similar?
Yeah, I think they're very similar substances. I think glycol is basically like ethylene glycol, antifreeze. You know, car antifreeze or whatever is ethylene glycol, which is just the alcohol dissolved version of it. But yeah, anything like that hasn't got, it's got a nice low freezing point. It isn't absorbed by the cell.
Yeah, it was just, I think it was for, I harvested some yeast from some nice Belgian beers that I enjoyed. And I just pitched that. But I think I can't remember what went wrong with it, but I feel like maybe it was just a bit more of a lag time than I expected. This isn't very informative. I hadn't heard of this idea of like different flavors being introduced in that lag period. But that's something that I'll put in my information bank to think about when I'm worried about slow takeoff on fermentation.
Sorry, just checking it. It's like glycerol, glycerin, not glycol. That's what I had, but yeah.
So how long do people store? So like an overbuild I've made last weekend, and at the moment it's just sitting there in a, you know, like a litre of the fermented starter wort plus the dregs of the yeast at the bottom of it. Is that how people would leave it? So I said, Steve, you said you decant and leave it in a much smaller thing with just a small amount of stuff on top, or?
Yeah, I swelled the whole thing up and then just poured into 3 or 4 little jars and let it settle out, put it in the fridge.
So sort of proportionately it's the same. You've got
a
lot of starter. I guess that will preserve it because it's going to be 3-4%.
Exactly, yeah. So there's some wort on top, and then it settles out as a little tiny millimeter high piece.
I decant sort of 80-90% of the supernatant and then swirl it up, so there's a bit of liquid there, and then when again, like it's being stored, it's still got alcohol in it and everything. So it's just so you don't end up with endless liquid sat on top of it, because you still find when you then put it in there, it's like then goes down to a fairly small amount on the bottom of the jar.
I might get a smaller container because it's also, I guess it's easier to store lots of sort of 100 ml, 200 ml pots rather than litre ones.
I've got some Schneider Weiss, which I grew up from the bottles and made a wheat beer with it last summer, and I've got some overbuild from that still in the fridge. So I'll let you know, because I'm about to do that in a couple of weeks.
That's right, because you're going to be making a starter with it anyway, aren't you? That's the point. So
exactly. So it should, if there's like a handful of cells in there, it should come back to life within a few days or something.
Yeah.
Then there'd be enough
time to go to the
pitch it all at high crowds and like swell up the entire thing and crush fingers and throw it all in. So the answer to that would be like a year. I mean, I've kept it for a year. I've kept stuff for more than a year sometimes, and grow it back up, and it seems to kind of kick off and be fine.
So I kept a Verdant that I just got from the bottom of the fermenter, but that I kept in, you know, the Kilner jars with the clip lids and the rubber seal. I left it for about 4 or 5 months, and the rubber seal had just gone really manky, so I just thought that's not good.
Yeah, the ball jars are better.
Yeah,
because you can then, I mean, they're designed to basically go into like a pressure cooker. So I take the ones I've got and I put a little bit of star san in them and then put them with some in a pressure cooker with water at the bottom for like 40 minutes. So they are sterile as good as you can. I think the only thing that can get past that is botulism, which I don't have a lot of in this house, that I know of anyway. So yeah, I've done that. The only thing I found with the smaller ones, that was the one time when I had infection issues, and I don't know whether it's because I was keeping a smaller amount of yeast and growing it up, whereas the bigger ones I've never had an issue with. But I've got to. The reason I did some the other day was because I've got to. I made a starter earlier on in the week and then changed my mind at the last minute over what I was going to brew, and decided not to use it. So I'll store that yeast for another day.
Yeah.
And then hopefully it will grow up fine. But yeah, I think for me, the longer you leave it, the harder it is to revive and less healthy it is. I've heard of people that have found stuff in the back of the fridge after a year. It's been fine. But it starts dropping off quite quickly because we don't have the practices to remove everything that's going to affect the viability of yeast.
I think the attrition rate's quite high. I think it's something like 50% over 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So on average, so it's like that's why we tend not to keep it more. I mean, we keep it whether we use it or not, whether it just sits in the fridge and then gets dumped after 2 weeks. But I always quite like the idea of keeping some anyway, just in case. And it's interesting actually also doing an amount of counting, seeing what yeast does come off quantity wise on different yeasts. Again, that's interesting.
Especially at these prices.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the going back to cropping briefly. So one of the things I have done is using yeast serially. So doing starting off with a pitch into a light beer, so something that's going to be 3-4%. And then going up to a middling beer, 6-7%, and then finishing off with a monster that's like sort of up to 12% in strength in the end. And each time taking off a portion of the yeast from the brew, cleaning the fermenter, and then pitching it back in. And I have put it onto the entire yeast cake in the past. I find the flavors a bit bland, maybe. So yeah, that's kind of another way, and the way I tend to do that is literally just leave, when I've racked it off into the keg, leave just a tiny amount of liquid on top, give it a good swirl up to get as much of a mix of yeast and stuff like that. And then in the past, if I'm going to be doing this, it's quite often I'm kegging the beer and then I'm going to clean the fermenter and then put a new beer straight into it. So to be honest, I've in the past just star sand a pint glass that's not long been out of the dishwasher, dumped the yeast into there, stuck a bit of cling film over it, and put it in the fridge for whilst I'm waiting, and then then it goes into the next beer as soon as that's done, and not had any issues doing it that way because you're pitching such an amount of viable yeast. That will tend to be, I'll tend to space the brews 2 weeks apart. You can do it a bit closer in some cases, but I've found if I do it too close, I've had issues with diacetyl and acetaldehyde in the beers because I'm taking it off yeast too soon. But that's another way of doing it. Yeah, the only thing I'm also careful about with that is adding dry hops to the fermenter. I'll tend to, when I'm doing that, try and basically either put them in a bag in the fermenter or put them in a bag in the keg, rather than dumping them loose into a fermenter, into the fermenter, just so you don't end up tainting the next beer. But I know I've heard of people washing yeast. I'm not sure about it myself. So does anyone repitch like that or do anything like that?
Repitch. I did a Kvike lager, and then I kegged that whilst I was boiling my next beer. I just cooled. I just cooled it and poured it straight into the fermenter. Didn't do anything. Didn't clean it or just chucked it straight in, and it worked. It went off like a bloody rocket. Within about 3 or 4 hours, it was gone mad. That seemed to work. I didn't get any off flavors, or just worked really well. And that saved 1 round of fermenter washing.
And 1 round of making starters. And
yeah.
So which yeast was that?
I think it's the Lutra liquid. No, the dried Lutra. Yeah. Is it Amiga? Do that one? There's a dried in the blue packet.
I know what I think. Yeah, but I haven't tried it.
I thought, yeah, I'll keg it whilst the other one's boiling, and then cool it down. And I was going to collect it and repitch. I thought, well, fuck it, I'll just pour it straight in. What's the worst that can happen?
I do that a lot with I find it's a good technique with lager yeast, because they're a pain to grow, they're a pain to grow up the quantity. So I'll do a Helles to a Festbier to a Bock and then to a Doppelbock. And that, like you say, not having to wash the fermenter is a joy, I think.
Oh, I can't do it. I can't leave it dirty like that with all the crud.
It's the OCD coming out, James.
It's just like you then. I have literally had issues in the past when crowds and getting onto the lid or side of a fermenter and dropping back in, causing an old solstice flavour in a beer. But yeah, I don't know. You never had any issue like that, Ian?
Not with the lagers. No, I'm just trying to think. I had an issue where, if I don't do that, then I dump it at the bottom. Chill it, dump it at the bottom, because I'm going to dry hop. And I had an issue there. I've had issues where I've tried to reuse a yeast when it's I think it did a double IPA, and then I tried to reuse it and it was knackered, absolutely knackered. But no, on the lagers, no, not too. Because also the liquid lager yeast, from memory, unlike some of the dry ones, the crowns are often. I left plenty of headspace, and it wasn't a lid toucher, whereas if it's the kind of thing where it's spraying out the top, then I probably would lose my nerve and clean.
Yeah, I guess the ideal would be like having 2 fermenters, and then you can sort of put one into the other and get it when the yeast is really active. But has anybody ever got yeast from a brewery? Because it seems to me like that's one of the things. Like obviously you've got not far from the club in Bermondsey, so many breweries, and you could just go along and say, can you just sort of stick some yeast in this Tupperware and take it home, pitch it? Anybody ever done that?
Yeah,
Right?
there used to be. I used to live in Boulder, Colorado, and there are a handful of breweries there that if you showed up with a mason jar that was sanitized and dropped it off on your way to work, you could come by at the end of the day and pick it up and buy a 6-pack. They had different yeast strains. Each brewery had a different strain, pretty much. Like Avery would use the London Y yeast 1028. Another one used the 1056. So you could kind of plan your brews around which brewery you were going to stop by. There's a brew pub that used lager yeast as well, Gordon Biersch in the US, and they're happy. Most breweries that did that were happy to do that, because they would just go over to the fermenter and draw some yeast off the bottom, and it was no trouble to them at all.
Something I've always been interested in doing, although obviously you need to get to a brewery first of all and do that, and then brew afterwards. But another thing, washing yeast. What does anybody think about the washing or rinsing yeast? I've seen people do it. Has anybody done it? Does anybody feel it's a good thing to do?
I've done it, but I've never actually reused the yeast that I washed. Through bad planning. So for me, it's a pain in the ass.
From what I've read, people say that it's probably not worth the bother, because it's another case of introducing another chance of infection. So I think, from what I gather, it's sort of 6 or 1 1/2 dozen of the other. But there's washing and rinsing, isn't there? Isn't there one way you use use acid to?
Well, there's the industrial practice is washing, where you acid wash it. where you basically reduce the pH to a point that it should inactivate other pathogens, and so you can then take off the yeast and rebuild it from there. But even for most breweries, it's kind of that, or they could just order a new yeast pitch. So it's kind of do that in desperate situations. But I think these days, if you've got supply of yeast, then if you're using dry yeast or got a yeast manufacturer, you can just order another pitch and go from there, really.
So that's washing, is it? Or that's washing.
That's yeast washing, acid washing it. And I've seen the yeast rinsing thing mentioned several times, but I'm kind of very speculative of it.
I mean, I think people talk about putting some water in there and then swirling it around, letting that settle, and then the next day doing the same. But I think people are saying, well, every time you're doing that, you're likely to get some infection in there. A little bit like doing a secondary fermentation or whatever in another bucket. It's sort of, it's you're what you're gaining is, it's a law of diminishing returns, and that you're probably better off just leaving it on. And I think the other thing was that if by leaving it on the beer, it's in a better environment than suddenly stressing the yeast out with changing the osmotic pressures or whatever, because you haven't got the salts and the sugar solution that's balancing things.
Yeah, I think the yeast have worked hard to produce an environment they're happy in.
Yeah, so leave them there. Yeah.
So I think the only time I could imagine doing it would be if you've got dry hops in the beer, but then the simple answer is just put them in a bag. And if you're going to reuse the yeast, it's for me, it's easier to do that than it is to try and unhop the yeast later on, or just take it out with some of the hops and not care.
Yeah, I mean, from what I gather, commercial brewers will, if they're after reusing their yeast, won't bother with biotransformation hopping. They'll just leave it till the end, doing it at the end, and that way they can keep their yeast. But if you're going to do that, otherwise, I think those that do biotransformations just chuck the yeast, because
we only take the yeast before we've dry hopped. We wouldn't dream of doing it after we've dry hopped. So it's between the time of soft crashing and it getting down to temperature. That's when we take the yeast that we're going to sort of reuse.
Because we're always late dry hopping.
And is that from a conical or?
Yeah, from a conical. Yeah. I mean, basically, I chucked the first couple of 100 ml because, in fact, one of the advantages of having the conical is that I can put nearly everything from the kettle into the conical. I leave it for about 5 hours, dump off the bottom 1.5 litres, which will have any crap in it, and then but then when it comes to dumping the yeast, I'll know that there's be a couple of 100 mils of rubbish at the bottom, and then keep the next couple of 100 mils and probably leave the last couple of 100 mils and chuck that away, with the idea of taking the middle section. So that it's the middle section of the yeast that you're after. If you're gonna,
Cool. Joel mentioned on the chat about what about getting yeast from a brewery by getting it from the dregs of a keg, same as a bottle but on a bigger scale. Anybody done that? I mean, I know of in the club, for our perpetual old ale experiment, somebody did that. I don't know how it's gone.
Has anybody ever kind of approached, local tap room that has something interesting and said, "Oh, can I have the dregs of that?" Before you send it back to the brewery? Because I can imagine you get some quite interesting stuff that otherwise you might not have access to. I was thinking about this recently because there's a tap room nearby that had got a lambic on tap. I don't know exactly what form of keg it was, because you don't really think of lambic being served in that way, but be all sorts of interesting bugs there.
Go for it, try it. I mean, I wouldn't
that's
necessarily.
beyond yeast, but
Well, yeah, I said I wouldn't necessarily ferment a batch primarily with it, but adding it to something, which again is kind of what I think I think so the prize old ale thing we're doing, somebody managed to get the dregs from a keg that had gone out commercially, and I think hand that off to Ken, and Ken's now got that going in some ales. So we're all sort of growing dregs up from various bottles and things like that, leaving it for 6 months to see what develops, because we're trying to get the Brett and stuff like that. But that's into finished beer with alcohol in it rather than primary fermenting with it. Yeah, another idea. I've heard of people doing it from the mini kegs that you can buy from some breweries. Same thing, really. But right, a bit more time. Should you grow up dry yeast? Any thoughts? Does anybody grow up dry yeast?
It seems a bit, because of the price of dry yeast, it seems a bit of an effort to, and also the cost of the DME involved is probably balanced out with, well, say 3, 4, 5 quid a packet anyway, so just buy 2. There's always been my thought on that. Whereas liquid yeast, obviously, there's a greater gain, isn't there? Especially now it's sort of 12, 13, 14 pounds a pack.
Yeah, I'm the same with that. Just stick 2 packs in. Not the wrapper.
We buy our yeast in a kilo, our dried yeast. So it does about 67 brews at 15 grams a thing, which we then reuse on average, say twice, sometimes 3 times, sometimes not at all. So it works out about 70p a go. So I'm quite happy with that.
How long does the brick last? Is it, or are you brewing so often that you get through that?
We do 3 brews a month, so it's every 10 days. That's between us down here in Tunbridge Wells and wrap up in London. So with your every 10 days, you've got your 2-week thing. So if you're reusing, that's absolutely fine. But it makes the yeast nice and cheap, and because we always do the same type of brews, apart from occasionally Raf does a saison or something and buys a White Labs thing, but most of our brews are IPAs and NEPAs and so on, so they'll take the Verdant quite happily.
So is that, are you buying a big block of Verdant, 500 grams?
Well, it's granules, yeah, but it's a kilo, yeah.
Kilo.
Yeah. But I know most of you lot sort of do lots of different brews. You're more interesting, but we just like IPAs and NEPAs, and so that's what we brew. We just brew what we like to drink.
70p is amazing.
Yeah.
Brew.
Yeah.
When I've bought the half kilo packs before now, I've asked Rob at the malt miller if he can actually sort of split it down into 100 gram sachets, and he'll sort of reseal it for me.
Yeah, we'll
and that helps actually keep it a lot longer as well. And again, it's just trying to minimize the cost, isn't it?
Yeah, as soon as we get it, Jerome vacuum packs it into 15 gram packets and then sticks it in the fridge. So
it's a fun hour and a half.
Same with
you don't want the police to come around when you're doing that, do you?
It looks worse with the water additions, I think.
Yeah, it's the water additions. You should, yes, when you're weighing them out on your little fancy scale.
A large range of white powders in my brewing box.
Nice.
Okay, so yeah, I think one of the other things is kind of talked about earlier on, that the dry yeast is packaged with all the sterols and everything it needs to rapidly multiply. Whereas if you put it through a starter, you might double the number of cells, but actually you've taken up sort of 90% of its sterols, so it's actually not going to be as vital. So yeah, I would definitely say maybe buy 2 packs instead, but it will go a long way. Certainly dry yeast is the number of cells supposedly, and the packet is almost irrelevant because it will grow up very, very quickly.
I think fermenters even recommend not even rehydrating it.
Yeah, I mean, Lalman do, but like yesterday, I chucked a packet of BRY 97 into a 1039 wort, and it was going this morning. So
we've never rehydrated. We'd always just go straight in.
Yeah.
The Verdant lot say put it straight in. I'm sure we saw a video from James at Verdant, and he said under pitch that they underpitch all their sort of NEPAs and things, and B, he said just put it straight in. So we haven't messed around with hydrating.
So by pitching it straight in, I suppose you've got the option. You've got one less stage in which you can pick up any infection from your jug, and and the water you're putting in, and you got to stir it with something and everything else, haven't you? So
yeah, just a little bit of spray on the actual thing that you're the pack you're opening, and the scissors, and then just whack it in. Yeah.
And did you guys were you guys using, I don't know, something like Nottingham before you switched to the Verdant?
I think the first one we had was Nottingham, and then there was another one we used for a while, and then we heard about Verdant, and we've been using that ever since.
And given that you use them so repeatedly on such a similar range of beers, what were your thoughts on the flavour differences between them, just out of interest?
We always, I've got a spreadsheet with all the tasting notes. The trouble is, sort of recent ones we've said we really like, but our taste has changed so much since the first brew. We're on to 31 at the moment. The first time we did a brew, we liked Brewdog and things like that. Now we can't stand them. They're just hopeless, so our tastes have changed. We've got more exacting sort of, when we taste something, it's more important that it's quite good. What's that for?
No, just say I've just bottom cropped 250 ml of yeast. My latest brew.
I thought that was a half pint of NEPA.
It's very hazy.
Don't get that mixed up.
I thought that was really. I thought you had a fairly fruity looking deeper earlier, Ian.
Yeah. No. I've just cropped that 10 seconds ago. That'll go in the fridge.
So mentioned briefly about underpitching there. I think that ties into one of the last topics we were going to say about stressing yeast.
Yeah. Well, James at Verdant says it gives them their good flavours, and he just discovered, presumably by chance, that they like the flavours it gets by underpitching. But having said that, we used to put 10 grams in sort of 25 litre fermenter, and now Jerome puts 15 in, so he's not quite so convinced. But there you go.
Do you notice a taste difference then, or the esters difference or something?
Not specifically between putting. I think it was because
there's been a few beers we've done where it's probably been slightly stressed, not necessarily from using 10 grams of dried yeast, but from reusing yeast and not having probably quite enough.
Yeah.
Sort of typically aim for sort of between 150 and 200 of sort of liquid yeast for the batch size we're doing when reusing it. But it's been a couple of times where we haven't quite had as much as 150, and it's tasted like it's been stressed a bit.
And when you say stressed, do you think only under pitching, or any other factors?
Under pitching and it giving off some slight off flavors.
Because the one thing I've had is I've seen repeatedly with trying to make a Weiss beer, people say, "Oh, you need to stress it, don't oxygenate it, underpitch it, abuse its mother," that sort of thing.
They're really nasty to it.
Yeah, shout at it. And I've, to be honest, I found more often than not, it ends up producing a ton of sulfur. That's just one of the signatures of those yeasts. But and actually just treating it normally, It seems to work as well, and maybe underpitch it slightly. So you get the sort of, so obviously some of those flavors you get come out during the growth phase. They're not sort of part of the main part of fermentation. So, but actually going too hard with it is counterproductive at the other end.
I'd imagine that it goes back to the cell count business. If from what I gather with Verdant, they underpitch, but he was, I can't remember. Yeah, but he was saying that they know what their cell count is. So they're being very precise about what they're doing. Whereas I think if it's, say if it was me, I don't know what my cell count is, so I wouldn't know whether I'm really underpitching. I mean, I imagine everyone's probably done an underpitch at some stage and has produced a beer that's been, for some reason, slightly different because they've stressed the beer in some way or whatever. Because I assume you can stress the yeast by different temperatures as well. I mean, presumably temperature at which you ferment is another form of stressing the yeast because you're taking it out of its happy zone.
Pressure as well?
Yeah. And presumably pH as well.
Yeah,
because the yeast pH is another thing that people go on about. Trying to keep the pH low on the lower end. And I think because, from what I gather, if you're making very hoppy beers, you're raising the pH by adding hops. So you're actually wanting to lower the pH, possibly by even adding acids into the fermenter.
Well, it's one of the first things the yeast does is lower the pH of the beer it's in to.
But I gather by putting a lot of hops in, you're raising the pH.
Yeah.
And therefore, you want, if you're doing hoppy beers, you want to be almost pushing the lower end of pH.
Sounds like it's time to break out the microscope, Joanne.
Yeah, I think it is. I think we need to do that.
I think
it
comes.
Report back.
Has anyone else done it?
No, I'd love to. I'm not sure my kitchen is sanitary enough.
I don't think it's not sanitary. It's how much time and fiddliness, because I have actually got a cell counter and the actual stain for staining it and so on, but it's down to making serial dilutions of your yeast. So you get some slurry, you make a dilution of it, and you know what your dilution factor is. You then stick a known quantity into a slide that has a particular volume, so that you fill this particular cell, and then you know that you've got X amount of liquid in there. And because it's flattened out to a point where you can count on a microscope, you can it's all gridded out, and you just take a square. You take a number of squares, random, and then take an average count, and that will give you your cell count by then working it back out the other way to how many cells there are in a milliliter or whatever. But it's one of those things. I think it probably is an evening's worth of work to do it.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting though, because the same as probably everybody else, we kind of do it by intuition, where you've kind of kept enough good-looking slurry for a certain amount of time, and you kind of think, well, that'll be enough. But to actually measure it, like big breweries do, and that's why they make it their business. But it'll be really interesting to see quite what the difference is between what we think we expect and what is on the plate for homebrewers in general. Really, just to know whether you're underpitching or you're vaguely in the right zone most of the time.
But I think this is where some of the data on, say, keeping yeast in a fridge for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or whatever comes from. Right. I mean, there are people who do this and then have sort of got an idea that, under these circumstances, this sort of will occur. But I ought to do it myself, though, because just for the crack.
But then, no, actually, you're right. So that's kind of extrapolated to make sure you don't keep it more than 2 weeks because it'll be dead.
Or use twice as much.
Yeah, or take 4 days to grow it up.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing for me comes down to get to know your yeast, get to know the strain. So rather than going all over the shop, it can get to be quite beneficial to get to know a few strains as to what they're going to do in any given circumstance. Because some will you get better flavour from slightly under pitching. Others you want to pitch a lot of. And yeah, I think and I think quite often the yeast can be a lot more adaptable to different styles than you'd necessarily think. I've made some good stouts with the USO5, Yeast 1056 that I tend to use, and I've also made a good lager with that as well. But although I do know that if you get down to 14, 15 degrees when you're fermenting with it, it can get quite peachy. It actually, if you taste that yeast partway through fermentation, it's quite peachy, but then it seems to clear all of that up at the end of fermentation. But I guess if you get too low a temperature, it doesn't do that. But it's really interesting. It's like some kind of sort of peach cordial kind of thing.
I found just talking about seeing what happens with various different yeast that the ice spindle has been a bit quite a revelation in that, or any device that can monitor the fermentation, because when using that, I've seen things like the difference between a first pitch and say a second pitch. The graph will be different. There'll be characteristics of things when I kept all the other constants the same. And that's quite interesting, using a device like that to show you what's been going on in the fermentation, the lag phase, the attenuation, and so on.
So what's the difference? Is it a slower or faster phase or quicker?
Well, what I mean is by using, you get it.
It doesn't go down as much usually.
I mean, having looked at, say, 100 different graphs of very similar beers using similar yeasts and so on, and comparing, you will see different profiles with different yeasts.
Yeah,
I mean, remarkably.
With the Verdant, for example, the FG tends to be sort of 10, 14, 16, whereas with the first time you use it, the dried yeast, it's sort of 10, 12.
Yeah, it attenuates more on the first.
But when you reuse it, it goes up a lot. And we actually had one that was sort of ended up at 17, 10, 17.
Yeah.
Was that a better tasting beer, like you're saying that?
Well, that's the thing.
Saying third generation was better.
It was quite good, yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'd say with that yeast, it's probably better to do a higher OG beer and on a third pitch, and let it, but knowing that it won't attenuate quite as much.
That's a good point. So each generation you'd adjust the.
We haven't actually been that methodical on it, but that is a good way of going about it. Yeah. It just happened that we were doing the one for lab, and therefore we wanted something a little bit stronger. So.
And it didn't need to attenuate as much. I mean,
but you can use that information then, but it is definitely, finishes much higher with the second and third generation.
Oh, interesting. Like James saying, you get to know the yeast.
Exactly. I mean, that's one advantage of just using the same yeast all the time, is that you do get to know it.
But then you see, I'm not oxygenating the second and third pitches because I'm using a dried yeast. I'm relying on the first pitch being, because it's dried yeast, don't need to use oxygen. Interestingly enough, I'm not using oxygen to supplement that idea that they're providing a yeast which has got everything you need to not oxygenate your wort.
And does it then not need oxygen on the
We just never,
second or third?
we've just never done it.
I've never done it, but I'd be interested to know. That would be another thing to do, is to see whether
see if it makes
it's necessary to oxygenate the second and third pitches, the subsequent pitches on a dried yeast.
That could be why it's not going lower.
Attenuating. I was going to say that exact same thing. I've no idea whether it is better or not, or would work or wouldn't, or
That's
what
the fascinating thing about all this, that there's so endless possibilities of trying out various experiments.
It's great that you keep lots of notes, you guys, as well.
I think Andrew, from memory, from Lallerman, said that it's only in its dried form that you can get away without oxygen. I think as soon as you're reusing, then effectively it's a wet yeast at that point.
I would imagine that's the case. Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
The last topic we had here was fermentation temperature management. What does everyone do for that? I stick mine in a fridge, set to a temperature. I know Serge has his cool sort of chiller called Conical. Does anybody else do anything different?
No, I stick mine in a fridge with the Ingbird and a heat belt to keep it saying its happy zone or whatever. Or the other thing is, the two I did at the weekend, there's lucky enough to have a place in the flat that stays at 18 centigrade. So they're both sitting there, 2 ales essentially sitting there. But try and keep it at the exact same temperature, I think. I've done it before where even with pressure fermenting, I've thought, the pressure will sort everything out. And that's been done in the summer and like during the day and the night, the temperature's fluctuating, and sometimes like really estery lager or something. But then, as you say, James, like stick it in the fridge under pressure with a heat belt, with an Inkbird, everything to keep it at the right temperature for the yeast to be happy, and that works much better.
If nobody else is going to.
Yeah, that's one thing about when you start your home brewing and after your sanitation, if you can control your temperature during your fermentation, I think that's the next big thing that is actually going to improve your beers big time. I haven't got a fridge, but I've got a big wooden cabinet with sort of 3 inches of king span lined in it. And I've got a flash cooler that runs in there. What do you call it? The Maxi 110 or 210, and just use a coil inside there and just catch all the condensate coming off the coil, and that just seems to hold the temperature. The only downside is I can't crash cool. It just doesn't get cold enough in there. Whereas if I had a fridge, I could crash cool it, but
yeah, I've been using a maxi chiller as well, but it's had quite a few problems. Like, it's all right if you've got a shed, but it's like next to our bedroom and they're pretty loud kind of thing, especially when the compressor kicks on at like 1 a.m. No, that's not great. Yeah,
this must be this must be a big no-no after your oven escapade.
Yeah, right. Yeah. We try not to bring that up again. Yeah. Yeah. Also, there's a lot of gunk in the maxi chiller. I don't know if it was just my one, but I wasn't sure how sanitary it was. Don't know if it.
What's the maxi chiller?
It's like they use it in pubs. It goes under the bar, and it's like
that thing. Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
That's
like a shelf chiller.
Bar cooler.
It is. Yeah.
Or remote cooler, do they say sometimes? I don't know.
Yeah. Flush it through with a bit of caustic soda.
Oh, it's packed up now.
That is what I'm using at the moment to chill up beer.
I didn't know that's what it was called. I picked it up on eBay in somewhere like Kingston, that sort of area, southwest London somewhere.
Oh, nice.
We
Yeah.
were-
Yeah, I got my original one quite cheap, but
Yeah,
I think because I plugged it into the Inkbird, so the whole thing would just kick on and it would pump round to get the temperature low. But I think cycling the compressor like that, or it was a dud unit to begin with, but it just doesn't cool anymore. So I don't know if I've broken it by
leave the
cycling
chiller
it
on,
on
aren't
and
you?
off.
And then you use the Inkbird to control a pump to pump the glycol round.
Yeah.
Seems to be the way to do it. And then otherwise you are
You're
just
cycling.
constantly chilling and cooling the whole ice bank.
Mm.
but all our beers in the conical fermenters go into a fridge, set at either 18 or 19, for about 5 days, and then we tend to raise the temperature up to one degree a day till it gets to 22, and then leave it for a few days for the diacetyl rest. But using an ice spindle and what's it, a duplex heater? Yeah, and a duplex heaters. Yeah.
I mean, the temperature control is, I think, with yeast is vital. Does anyone oxygenate their wort?
Yes.
Because I mean, that's going back to yeast health, isn't it? I mean, we're not oxygenating it for any other purpose than to give the yeast some helping help. So you do. Does anyone else?
Yeah, I've got
Yeah,
those
Rob
little
does.
welding.
Yeah, I do.
Sorry.
Yeah, I've got those are the 5 micron stainless steel sinter stone, and mine just gets whacked on the end of a piece of beer line and sort of waved around in your fermenter for about 5 minutes. I haven't got a flow control on it, so and my regulator on my cylinder is a welding regulator anyway, so
Rubbish. Yeah.
probably far too much oxygen going in there for what we need. So I've hardly
Probably-
pressed the
you
valve.
probably-
It's like going mad and producing lots of foam on top of your beer.
I think you are probably overdoing it a bit.
Massively, yeah.
I mean, it's not long from what I gather. Sort of 1.5 minutes, depending on your pressure and so on, your flow rates. Obviously, ideally you'll be measuring that. But from what I gather, it's quite precise. The amount of oxygen that you're meant to be adding. Too much can be a problem, and obviously not enough also a problem. But seems to be quite a precise amount.
So I use an oxygen cylinder. I use one of the disposable welding oxygen cylinders, rather than getting a big tank. But they last me quite a while. And I tend to I'll do 1 liter of oxygen, and I have a flow regulator or flow meter, which seems to be accurate, from just testing it by literally putting a 1 liter jug full of water upside down, putting the stone underneath it and testing how long it took to fill it up. So that seems to be correct. And yeah, it's coming out of without any kind of flow meter, that would really be blasting it out. God knows how many liters per minute. I'd probably end up emptying the bottle in within 2 or 3 batches. Whereas normally it seems a bottle lasts me about 20 brews, less than it could be. But yeah, I'll tend to run it at 1 liter per minute for a minute. I think it's a 0.5 micron stone on the end of a sort of steel rod that I use on some beer line. Yeah, all works well.
Yeah, my cylinder was picked up on eBay really, really cheap. So some guy was just getting shot of it, and it was still really heavy. So I reckon it was pretty much full of oxygen. I've had that for about 6 years.
Well, that's the thing, is like when you move up to a proper cylinder, it's not that expensive. And yeah, you can and will last a lifetime. Whereas the little welding ones are quite expensive in comparison.
You can get, I don't know, we use Adams gas, but most of those gas companies will do oxygen because of welding and so on. along with the CO2. But yeah, you don't need a lot, do you?
I've not used it. I was interested what the difference is like with oxygenating it. Is it just yeast? How does it?
Faster, cleaner ferment.
Yeah.
It's what all the commercial brewers do. And there's probably, if they do it, then there's a reason for it. Because otherwise it'd be a waste of oxygen.
I already feel like a waste of oxygen.
I mean, from the biology of the yeast, yes, they need oxygen at that point to produce lipid membranes or whatever they do in this lag phase. And for healthy yeast, a good oxygen at that point is the only time that your water, your beer ever needs oxygen. But just at that point, I'd be interested to know how soon after that you've got to be pitching your yeast, because whether this oxygen, whether it's minute critical or hour critical or whatever. Don't know whether anyone knows that.
What does the literature say?
Sorry, what was that?
Well, when you oxygenate, are you doing that immediately prior to pitching your yeast?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I do mine once it's pitched.
Right.
I've done that as well. It's no difference. So.
Right.
So if it's so good, why aren't we doing it?
Because if you're using dry yeast, then you don't really need to.
But on the second and third, yeah.
Well, yeah. If you're not having a problem, then you've not got a problem. So.
Yeah, but it could be better.
Yeah, it could be. It could have first place.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how the attenuation was affected. Oxygenating on those second and third pitches.
Yeah,
really interesting.
Right.
Yeah, I'm going to try that and see what's what on that one.
Cool. Oh, that covered off all the questions and points we had on there. Unless somebody's got something else they haven't raised yet. Has anybody got any burning questions about yeast they would still like to ask?
What are people's favourite yeasts? Desert island. You got one yeast you can take with you.
That's a very good question.
I like the Imperial Urkel.
Sorry?
Imperial Urkel.
Oh, right.
It's quite nice. Like,
I'm going to be boring. I'm going Nottingham.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, you're covering all bases there.
Yeah, but only because I brew mostly English style beers anyway, and bitters and porters.
Yeah.
So.
You could even get away with lagers at a pinch with that. I think it's the dull but practical answer. I think I'm with you there, mate.
I'm like I said, 1056 for similar reason. The only thing I wouldn't use it for is obviously like Belgian stuff and probably English bitters, because there's just not enough character to it. But for everything else, I mean, even for stouts and things like that, it lets the malt shine. In the hoppy beers, it lets the hop shine. And so if that was the one, that would be it. But I do really like, for British beers, Imperial AO9 pub. Excellent.
If it was a desert island, I think then a Kvike, because you're probably going to not have it.
Temperature control.
Somebody did mention actually, sorry, about starters and the temperature to keep starter at, actually. Sorry, I didn't sort of go through that one.
Yeah,
but
that's me. Just wondering whether it is a thing or you just do it at whatever ambient temperature you happen to have in your house.
I think unless you're in an oven or an igloo, it's kind of fine.
Does it seem to make a difference between lager or ale yeast? I mean, is it dependent on the temperature of your starter in relation to the fermentation in your fermenter for the bulk of your ale, or for the bulk of the beer?
That's a good point, because they often go on about trying to keep your starter at the similar temp. Yeah. So
and when you pitch, they're saying you shouldn't have any more than a few 2, 3, 4 degrees difference between your starter temperature or your rehydration vessel and the temperature of the bulk wort. So if you want to have a lager and you're going to be fermenting down at, say, 12, 13 degrees, in theory, you should have your starter at a similar temperature. You don't want that 18, 19, 20, do you?
Because otherwise it's going to produce a load of esters in your starter, right?
Yeah.
I thought that was just for pitching.
Oh,
I
is
thought
it?
actually,
Yeah.
I thought actually you could run your starter.
I think you can run it quite high. I think you can run your starter surprisingly high.
What would be the difference, though? Because it's a mini fermentation, right? So it's going to produce the esters it would produce at that fermentation temperature.
But then you're going to pitch it into a bunch more wort, sort of 10 times the amount again, and it's going to reabsorb a lot of that. Or you're going to decant it and get rid of it.
I think it was this idea that your starter would be at a similar sort of temperature to what it should be operating at, rather than being be reproducing at, say, I don't know, 25, 26 degrees or something.
Rob, what do you do with your lager yeast? What temperature do you have your starter at?
Yeah, just room temperature and bring it in. Yeah, like I don't know. Weirdly, I think if I was going to alter the temperature, I'd probably make the starter warmer to like really get it going. I think yeast go best at like 32 or something, don't they? But
yeah,
don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think yeast right up there, 28, certainly 28 degrees is a good temperature for yeast if it was doing what it wanted to do.
Yeah, I suppose with the starter, you're most focused on just yeast count, yeast like cell count and nothing else.
Yeah.
So
does flavour not come into it in a starter?
Well, you're not producing it. You're not giving it enough time to produce any of that.
And if we care about the flavour, we're doing starters all wrong, aren't we? Like,
yeah.
Everything we do is bad.
So, Rob, do you cool down the wort to the temperature you want to ferment at for lagers before you pitch, but then you'll pitch room temperature yeast into it?
Yeah, like if I can. So basically, the only thing would be if it takes too long, I'd pitch it a bit early. But yeah, I try and get it down to like 9. That's horrible for yeast, isn't it? I'm just thinking that like a warm starter and pitching it like really low. Maybe they're getting like a bit of a shock from that.
Yeah, so I was trying to get mine at the weekend. I was trying to get it down to 11. It just wasn't going with the CFC with the water temperature at the moment. So
yeah, I think it gets to a point you've just got to get the yeast in and
yeah, I mean, I think that the growing the yeast is separate from the fermentation. I don't, contrary to what we're saying, that I don't treat the starter as a mini fermentation. I treat it as you're growing yeast. Personally, and if lager yeast, it will grow better at a higher room temperature. So I do that, and then usually decant it and pitch it, or before the wort's got too gross, pitch the whole lot.
Out of interest, has anyone measured the gravity of their starter pre and post the process?
Only when I've had questioned whether the starter has done anything.
Right.
No, I haven't actually.
I'm just wondering how much, whether the point about how long you leave it is to do with, if you're trying to grow the yeast, you want it in the growth phase, you don't want it in the alcohol producing phase. So is that part of what you're doing with the idea of not leaving it too long? So I'd just be interested to know, say, like how much attenuation you're getting once you've got your starter, and you're producing a starter. As you say, it's not a mini fermentation. You're actually after growth, aren't you?
Okay.
So presumably it shouldn't ferment that much, your starter. So is the point of, say, almost getting it at Krausen or whatever? Or are you just leaving the whole thing to do it?
I think because you're massively over pitching, aren't you, with the starter? I think you're pitching what you'd normally pitch into, like, say 10 litres if you're trying to build something up to be twice, and you're pitching it into 2 litres. And so I think it just rips through. That's why it's done so quick, isn't it? It rips through it in 24 hours or so.
Yeah, I mean, I've never really measured it because I've never worried too much about it. I'm either going to dump the whole lot in early on after the starter, after sort of 24 hours, or chill the whole lot out and only pitch the yeast. So,
Joe, are you trying to like work out the optimum time to pitch the starter in the?
Yeah, that was what I was wondering.
Yeah, so if you could have like a mini eye spindle, for example, that would tell you it's now past the growth phase and it's about to start the alcohol producing stage, then jump in now and pitch it into your brew day. Bring your brew day to today and pitch it in like right now.
Yeah, that was sort of what I was sort of getting at. That is there,
But I've never measured it. It's really interesting to know the difference if you leave it for like a couple of extra days or chill it down. Does it have an FG of its own that is radically different from when it's clearly bubbling and is all vital and vibrant, and that's a good time to pitch it into the beer?
It's easy to measure, isn't it? We can,
yeah,
a few of us could, if we got different methods of when we're looking to pitch. Because mine, I've only done it twice, but I've left it to completely finish and drop out, so I can decant off the crap and then swirl it and chuck it in. Whereas it sounds like James does it earlier than that, when it's kind of probably still fermenting.
That was my thinking, is that if it's in the middle of fermenting, that's the time to put it into a big load of work.
When you put it into the next load of work, though, it's going to revert back to the lag or the growth phase,
because it has to grow more.
Yeah, because it's going to be growing up again sort of 10, 20 times.
I have a question. I've always thought, how does the yeast know how much work you've pitched it into to know how long it has to grow for? How the fuck does it know that?
Philosophical.
How does it
They
know?
have a separate yeast YouTube channel.
Wow, that's meta.
There's some yeast that go around with clipboards and go, "We've got quotas, guys."
You see, that's a world I want to know about.
Maybe there's a yeast equivalent to the bee, sort of woggle dance, whatever it's called. It all goes off to the far corners of the vessel and reports back.
Do you know what I mean? Every time I pitch it, I'm like, how does it know how much to grow? Because it must then know what it's been pitched into to know how long does it grow, or does it just use up all the food, for one of the better expressions?
Surely it's something it can tell the density of the work. That's how I would assume. Hello.
Yes.
Does it? I
mean, does it? Does it know? It must know somehow.
It must be something to do with osmotic pressure.
Well, I wonder if it's just something as stupid as the fact that they multiply as many times as they can until they start bumping into each other too much, and then
I swear to God, I think that's exactly it. I swear to God, I think that's it. It's
how do they know?
Going until they run out. Right?
Well, it's a little bit like, Steve, you didn't know how big the world is until you started bumping into people, right?
I think this is the perfect answer. I think this is exactly the right answer. All of these answers, until there's a certain density of yeast cells within the world.
I don't know. It can't be that complex, given we're talking about a single cell organism here. It's
with no brain, which is what I felt like this morning. That's another story. But yeah, no, okay, that's I was just interested. It worries me every time. For some reason.
Yeast have feelings too.
I have a better question. You know, because you can dry Kveik yeast, or however you say it, in the oven on like greaseproof paper, and it will last like 20,000 years in your fridge, kind of thing. And then you just drop a little bit of the biscuit yeast into your wort, and off it goes. Does that only work for Kveik, or could you do that with any wet yeast or any dry yeast that's been pitched several times to wet yeast? So could you have like little dried chips of verdant, or little dried chips of, I don't know, 1056, or some esoteric saison yeast or something like that?
I don't think it even works for all Kveiks.
Okay.
So not every culture will dry. I think it's a genetic thing in the yeast that allows it to desiccate like that, and it needs to be selected for over lots of generations. So I think like a verdant, it may be by random chance, but
so not all Kveiks even.
Yeah.
Kind of lumping them together in a
like
terrible
some,
generic.
especially if they pitch on a lot, it would never have evolved that ability to dry, like most do, but I think not all.
I've got some
thoughts. A similar question, because with the yeast ring, the sort of traditional Kveik yeast ring, that you keep it attached and then you drop that into the wort the next time, and people the Kveik. But that said about running it through, basically top cropping it. Now I've got a Kveik going at the moment, and I want to do exactly what you're saying, Steve, to dry it out. And but I can't top crop it now. So what I'm planning to is getting some of that slurry, and I'm going to put it, smear it in some greaseproof paper. But does that work? Have you ever done that? Yeah. Or actually, do you have to do it for top cropping?
I've done it from slurry before.
Okay.
And it worked. Me too. Yeah. But not with Voss, but I did it with some old.
I think in the there's like a Kveik directory, and it will say if it's traditionally top cropped or bottom cropped and traditionally dried or stuff. Like that's not like a must do, but if you're drying a yeast from slurry that was traditionally top cropped, it will change the characteristics over time. So like it will only stay roughly similar if you treat it the same way it's always been treated, kind of thing.
I'm going to have to try that with verdant. I'll dry some out and see what happens.
Interesting to hear. And obviously, I guess Kveik yeast have sort of been selected for that because the way they've been kept for long before we had refrigeration or indeed knowledge of what yeast was.
They have those circle things that look like Christmas wreaths, don't they? And they dip them in and then dip them in the next brew.
And there's talk as well about sort of Vikings having the magic beer stirring stick.
Right.
That they would sort of hand down, that were sort of family heirlooms that were handed down through generations. And obviously every time they didn't know anything about yeast, so they'd sort of then just stir the beer with a magic stick, and then they'd have beer. Yeah. So yeah, obviously it's been selected to do that for a long time. I'm going to say at 9:40 p.m. we're going to call the end of the meeting there. Thank you everybody for coming along and discussing this. It's been very good as always. Feel free to hang around and chat away a bit more if you feel like it. I'm a bit tired this evening, so I'm going to give up at that point. But yeah, thank you everybody. Our next online meeting will be June the 19th, I think, and the next in-person meeting is June the 5th. So we will see you then. I don't think we yet have a subject for the next online one, but we might do something similar to this, sort of going into, had a few ideas around sort of fining and packaging, or malt or looking at different kinds of malt and things like that, or anything else people want to discuss, really, please say, and we'll just sort of go and do one of those again. So,
yeah.
Anyway,
Cool.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Good night. Cheers.
Cheers.
Hello.